Hurricane Sally getting stronger as it heads for Mississippi and Louisiana. Sally could make landfall as a Category 2 storm. NBC News meteorologist Michelle Grossman joins me now. Michelle, I never see you under good circumstances. Tell us where this storm is headed now, when it's expected to make landfall. And it is wonderful to see you, by the way, despite the circumstances.
I know. I always love seeing you. At least we still have some texting. We could do that outside of these storms. But yeah, we are looking at another storm. We are in peak season of this tropical season, and it is living up to this time of year because we are so busy. I did want to start with showing you a snapshot of the tropics because we have 5 systems right now in the tropics, and that is the busiest it's been since 1971. So we do want to talk about Sally. That's the most immediate threat as we go throughout the next 4 days, really. So watches and warnings all up and down the coast here. We're looking at hurricane warnings from New Orleans, Biloxi, Mobile, Alabama, but Sally did make a really big shift to the east, so it looks like New Orleans is going to dodge any sort of huge impacts. We're going to get some rain, of course, but we're not going to. Most of the impacts will be off to the east. Here's the latest on Sally, 160 miles southeast of Biloxi, Mississippi. Winds at 90 miles per hour, so that is a very strong Category 1 storm. Most likely will become a Category 2 storm later on today, if not tomorrow morning. Winds at 90 miles per hour. You only need winds at 96 miles per hour to be a Category 2 storm. Moving west-northwest at 7 miles per hour. So that is really, really slow, and it's going to get slower. We're going to see it moving maybe 3 miles per hour, so we could walk up faster than that. That is the bad news because we could see a lot of rain being dropped over the next few days. So tracking Sally, Category 1 storm right now. I mentioned that it's going to become a Category 2 storm by later on tonight into the early parts of Tuesday morning. And then it's Tuesday evening where we're going to see landfall somewhere along the Mississippi-Alabama coast. So that has changed too since the latest advisory. It has slowed down and it has moved a lot to the east. And then look, by Thursday, we're still seeing lots of rain being dropped. So we could see up to 2 feet of rain in some spots. Here's that flood threat where you see in the green 8 million at risk. And typically we see 5 to 10 inches with storms. We're going to see 6 to 18 generally and even up to 2 feet. So this is a very dangerous situation. Keep in mind, the #1 cause of deaths, weather related, is from flooding. So this is something to watch over the next several days. Storm surge, we always talk about that too. That's that push of water onto land. We're going to see 7 to 11 feet storm surges in some spots where you see that hot pink, and that's going to be over a long period of time as well. So these coastlines are just going to be battered. No doubt we're going to see some power outages, and we're going to see some destruction as well. So talking about the slow moving nature of Sally, we had Laura that moved through very, very quickly. The winds were high, but it moved fast. This is sort of opposite. It's moving slower, and the big impact will be the rain. So it's a really dangerous situation. Right now, again, moving at 7 miles per hour, but it's going to slow down to 3 to 5. And really, when we're on our treadmill, we're between 3 and 5 as we walk relatively slowly. So that is not good news. Now, this is why we have high pressure kind of blocking it. So it's sort of like a sit and spin when you're little, or maybe it's a road block you want to think of when you're driving. It is not letting you steer out of the way. So our steering currents are up to the north. And if we look at the historical nature of this, it's due to the climate change. So we're seeing more blocking patterns. They're likely, and we're going to see that in the future as well, also causing weaker steering current. So it's not moving it quickly out of the way. And the results will be more slow-moving storms. You remember Dorian last year that dropped just a ton of rain over the Bahamas. Well, this is what we're going to see with this storm as well. When you think of 2 feet, that is a lot of rain. So I also want to mention, in addition to the historical nature of what's happening in the tropics right now with 5 storms churning, and then again, that hasn't happened since 1971, every single storm this season has been the earliest on record, with the exception of Eduardo, and that was the 5th named storm. We are now up to our 20th named storm, so I'll kind of go through these graphics just to show you where we are in our names list. There are only 21. So we were at our 20th. That was named today, Vicky. So we're thinking that this is going to remain a fish storm. That means it's going to remain out in the Atlantic. But still, we only have 1 storm left. Our hurricane season does not end until November 30th. So we still have a ton of time, Allison. Yes, we're probably going to get to that storm most likely, and then we go on to the Greek alphabet. So this tropical season is historical in so many ways.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.